dancing was her freedom. It was like her wings. Like she just drifted. You could see in her face. She just drifted. She had so much fun. She had so much power in her movements, but yet still had a lot of grace.
I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press, and this is Ground Game. The coronavirus pandemic ranks among one of the most consequential stories ever covered by the Associated Press in its 170-year history. Here to take you inside the outbreak is AP's Ralph Russo.
From the Associated Press, this is Inside the Outbreak. I'm Ralph Russo. Today is Tuesday, April 28th. The Centers for Disease Control has provided the Trump administration plans and guidelines designed to help restaurants, schools, churches, and businesses safely reopen as coronavirus restrictions are gradually lifted. The CDC is recommending things like closing break rooms and having school children eat lunch in their classrooms instead of cafeterias. The administration will use them to form the basis of its own plan for reopening business, and ultimately governors and local officials will determine what happens next. The death toll worldwide from the pandemic is now more than 212,000. On today's episode of Inside the Outbreak, we'll speak with two AP editors who are working to put names and stories to the staggering number of deaths. Raghu Vadarevu is AP's digital storytelling editor for Global Enterprise, and Peter Prengaman is AP news director for the Western United States. They are leading AP's Lives Lost series, which you can find at apnews.com. AP reporters all over the world are writing obituaries about some of the extraordinary, if not famous, people who have been lost to COVID-19. We'll talk to Raghu and Peter about why it's important to tell their stories. Joining me today is Raghu Vadarevu, who is AP's digital storytelling editor for Global Enterprise, and Peter Prengaman, AP news director for the Western United States. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me today. So when there is death related to a major news story, it's normal to start thinking about how to cover the victims. Part of that is tied to simply confirming who has died. Covering the victims of COVID-19 could be an overwhelming task because of the sheer number of people. It's even dwarfed the number killed on 9/11. So Raghu, what was the thought process and plan behind covering victims of the pandemic?
I think you're right, Ralph. I mean, these stories, every day you look at the television or on websites and you just see the numbers increasing. And it quickly becomes kind of an abstraction. And I think in this particular case with the Lives Lost project, I think what we're trying to do is to try to bring that abstraction down to reality, right? I mean, these are people, they've lived lives that are important to the loved ones that they're leaving behind. I think that's what we tried to set out to capture.
And I would add to that, when you step back and you think about this virus and all the suffering and pain it's caused, by far the largest scar when this is all over is going to be the people who were left behind. And as you said, Ralph and Raghu, I mean, it's enormous to try to capture this. So what can we do? Well, I mean, we have to be modest and realistic. Like there's no way to capture the full scope of something like this. But what we can do is capture the lives of individuals from around the world, the impact that they had on family that they left behind, and through that tell some of the larger story of this major scar.
Peter, when writing an obit about a person who is not famous, I mean, generally speaking, with the AP and most news organizations, there's a certain level of fame that comes with an obit. But when working on one for somebody who's not famous, what is trying to be captured?
It's a good question. And, through the editing process and working with people, we've all had to learn quite a bit because we know how to do an obit at the AP, right? If the person's famous, we may even have some prep for it. And there's even a structure, right? Joe, whoever who did this and this and this has died. He was 86. Like, we know how to do that. But what about an average common worker in Wuhan, China, or a mother of 4 in Detroit who liked to ballroom dance? Like, how do we do an obit like that? And the way to do it is to dig into that person's life through their family, through their friends, through colleagues, and reconstruct a little bit of who they were and what they meant to the people who are leaving behind.
How do we decide who is written about after they die?
That's a good question. I mean, I think every life that has been lost here is worth writing about. I think when we're practicing journalism, so much of it depends on how much detail we can get to give readers, viewers, the most complete, full story of someone's life. I mean, and I think a lot of times what we end up gravitating towards are those stories where we do know some details about people's lives. I mean, Peter mentioned the Detroit mother who loved to ballroom dance. I mean, when you start to get into her life and through her brother's retelling of it, I mean, you start to really appreciate how much she loved to just dance and how animating of a force that was in her life. And you can even tell through his remembrance of her in audio. It's those little details that make these lives more easily remembered.
So sticking with the audio element embedded into some of these stories, they are very powerful. And I'm wondering, Peter, speaking specifically of that part, the audio element where you can hear a family member or friend talking about a loved one, what stories have stood out to you?
Oh man, quite a few. One that really stands out was just from a few days ago, on a doctor named Amjad Al-Harani. He was born in Sudan, immigrated when he was 11 to England, and became a really high-level, respected doctor. And what strikes me about him is that his family said that he never saw himself as extraordinary. And in fact, if he could come back from the grave and see that the way people are mourning him, he would be embarrassed by the whole thing. And he would say to people, come on, get on with it. And the audio remembrance that we have in the story is from his brother. And his brother is remembering how, he never complained. And in fact, everybody brought complaints to him. And then the brother is also reflecting a little bit on this doctor's son, who's 18. And while the entire family, the extended family is mourning and they don't want to talk and they feel bad, the 18-year-old son of the doctor who's fallen is in many ways like his father in saying, come on, people, get on with it. Let's remember his life. And he would want us to move on. And that's really powerful, that the son is like the father in so many ways.
And Raghu, I'll put the same question toward you. You mentioned the woman from Detroit, mother of 4, who loved to dance. Again, I'm sure there's a wealth of stories that you could pull from. But when you talk about listening to those audio bites from family members, any other ones that stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. I mean, we did a story of a World War II veteran in Washington State. He spent his life building roads, and that was sort of a carryover from what he did during World War II. And what struck me about the audio remembrance from his daughter was that, he used to carry around a photo of the vehicle that he used to help build those roads in World War II. And it was his pride and joy. And you glimpse little moments of people's lives like that. It's a moment that we can connect with them. I mean, who doesn't have that memento, that little item that you can look at, feel good about, and feel that you've accomplished something in your life.
He was very proud of his role during the war. He drove an armored cat, and he carried a picture of him standing beside this enormous cat in his wallet, and would often share it with random people when I would take him out.
So that was one that stood out to me. Another one was we did a piece on a woman in Louisiana who's a sort of matriarch of this family. And we had her grandson talking about how deep her religious faith was and relaying this sort of very kind of humble story about how when she had just like a few dollars in her purse, she was so religious, such deep faith, that when she went to church, she gave those last dollars to the tithing, even though that money was going to be the thing that they needed to buy food.
My grandmother got up one Sunday morning, and all she had in her wallet was $10. Now, with the $10, she either could place it in church, or she could feed her family, her husband, and her 3 kids at the time. That morning, she gave her last, which was the $10, not knowing how she would feed her family.
I mean, it's just such a window into someone's personality, someone's life. I think that those are the ones that really reflect, I think, the best of this series.
Ralph, if I could, let me add a little bit about the audio and how this came about. So when we were first starting with this, Raghu and I were I think really both drawn to this topic and wanting to do something with this. And so we're brainstorming is, okay, we could do, these short stories. We don't want them to be vignettes. We want them to be longer. Where are we going to get the photos? Those are most likely going to come from the families. And then we thought, well, what about video? What about audio? What about stuff like that? And Raghu had the idea to do audio. And one of the reasons to do that was because we can't just send people to do interviews with family members because, in some cases they may be infected themselves. And AP journalists around the world are taking, enormous risks in a lot of what they're covering day to day, but we have to minimize that. And so we simply don't want to be dispatching, an all formats team to the family, of somebody who died in Italy because it's too much of a risk. And so Raghu had this idea of well, what if we asked them to do audio? So it was kind of born out of that, and it's become, one of the centerpieces of these stories.
So the last thing I'll ask you is, how long is the plan to keep this series going? Is the idea that we will do this, the AP is going to do this throughout the pandemic? It seems like, again, a sort of a monumental task considering all the death associated with this story.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Ralph. Like it would be wonderful to stop these stories because people would stop dying, but more than 200,000 have died already around the world, and there's no end in sight. So I guess I would say for us, there's no end date either. These stories are important, trying to capture the lives of these people and, a little bit about where they're from, their countries, their cultures, religions, all these things that come into these stories is really important. So for now, we stick with it and hope to hear from, many more reporters around the world who want to work on these stories.
Raghu Vadarevu is AP's digital storytelling editor for Global Enterprise, and Peter Prengaman is AP News Director for Western United States. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today, for providing such great insight, and please be well and stay safe.
Thanks for having us.
At apnews.com, today's One Good Thing feature is about joy. Even during a pandemic, joy is visible, often without the normal recognizable cues. You just have to look a little harder to find it. Is a laugh or smile and it's heartwarming if it's hidden from view? Are eye crinkles the new prompts of a smile covered by a mask? A photo gallery of joyful and happy moments is today's One Good Thing. You can see that and get all of AP's coronavirus outbreak coverage at apnews.com.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. We'll be here every step of the way during this extraordinary moment in American politics and American life, giving you all the news you need to know. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Some of the details of our discussion may have changed by the time you hear this. For up-to-date developments on all of your news, head over to apnews.com. From
the Westwood One Podcast Network.